They left him on the steps of the Galveston County Home for Destitute Children on a Tuesday morning in October of 1880, and the only thing 6-year-old Elijah Cobb carried with him was a scrap of sailcloth his mother had pressed into his hands before she disappeared into the fog of the harbor. What nobody in that shelter knew, what nobody in any of the foster homes or work camps that followed would ever guess, was that 20 years later, a hurricane would carry a boat stitched from scraps straight into the arms of the one person who had never stopped looking for him. But that is getting ahead of things. Let me tell you how it happened. The matron at the county home was a woman named Mrs. Flagg, and she had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same driftwood that washed up along the Galveston seawall. She took the boy by the wrist, not the hand, and pulled him inside without a word. The hallway smelled of lye soap and boiled turnips. 42 children lived in that building, and not one of them had a bed to themselves. Elijah was given a corner of a straw mattress shared with 2 older boys who smelled like the tannery where they worked 6 days a week. He clutched that scrap of sailcloth against his chest and did not cry. He did not cry because his mother had told him one thing before she left. She had knelt down on the dock, her dress soaked at the hem from the tide, and she had said, "Elijah, I am not leaving you. I am going to find your father's people across the water, and I will come back for you. Keep this cloth. It is from the sail of the boat your father built with his own hands. When I return, you will know me by the matching piece." She never returned, or so everyone believed. Elijah grew up in the way that unwanted children grew up on the Texas coast in those years. He was put to work at 8, sweeping fish guts at the Strand wharves. At 10, he was apprenticed to a sailmaker named Horace Deeney, a man missing 3 fingers on his left hand, who could still stitch a tighter seam than any whole-handed man in the Gulf. Horace was not kind, but he was not cruel either, and that was the best Elijah had known. The old sailmaker taught him the double flat seam and the round stitch, and how to cut canvas so the wind would fill it like a lung taking breath. He taught him how to waterproof cloth with linseed oil and beeswax. He taught him how to read the sky, for weather, how to smell a storm 2 days before it arrived, that copper tang on the wind like blood on your tongue. By the time Elijah was 14, he could build a sail from nothing. Horace would bring him scraps from the shipyard, torn jibs, shredded mainsails ripped apart by squalls, canvas bags that had carried coffee from Brazil, and Elijah would lay them out on the workshop floor and see the shape of a sail, the way a sculptor sees a figure inside a block of marble. He always stitched. His fingers were never still, but Galveston did not want Elijah Cobb. The shelter boys were considered less than nothing in that city, and the families along Broadway Avenue with their grand Victorian mansions and their oleander gardens crossed the street when they saw him coming. A banker named Hartwell once spat at his feet and said, "Shelter rat, you will never amount to anything more than the scraps you sew together. Remember that." Elijah remembered. When Horace Deeney died in the summer of 1894, he left Elijah nothing but the workshop and a debt of $40 to a creditor who seized the building before the old man was even in the ground. Elijah stood on the street with his tools in a canvas bag and that same scrap of sailcloth his mother had given him 14 years earlier, now soft as chamois from the oils of his hands. He was 20 years old. He had no home, no family, no money, and no prospects. The creditor, a man named Partridge, told him he could sleep in the alley behind the building if he kept the rats out of the grain store next door. So Elijah slept in an alley, and he kept stitching. He scavenged materials from the beach after every storm. Galveston sat on a barrier island barely 8 feet above sea level at its highest point, and the Gulf was generous with its wreckage. Timber, canvas, rope, copper fittings, green with verdigris, barrel staves, cork, sheets of tin. Elijah collected everything. He dragged it to a place he had discovered when he was 12, a place no one else in Galveston seemed to know about or care about. On the west end of the island, past the last of the beach houses and the saltgrass flats where the mosquitoes bred in clouds thick enough to choke a horse, there was a depression in the earth where an old cistern had collapsed decades ago. It had been built by one of the early settlers, a German immigrant who had dug deep into the island's clay substrate to store rainwater. The cistern walls were brick, 3 feet thick, lined with a natural clay that had hardened to something like stone. The collapse had created an underground chamber roughly 20 feet across and 8 feet deep, shielded from the wind on all sides, with a natural drainage channel that kept it dry even during the seasonal floods. The temperature inside stayed cool in summer and surprisingly warm in winter, the earth itself acting as insulation against the brutal Gulf Coast heat and the occasional blue northers that swept down from the plains. Elijah had stumbled into it as a boy, chasing a feral cat through the saltgrass. He had fallen through a gap in the earth and landed on brick, and when his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw the curved walls and the vaulted ceiling of old mortar and shell concrete, and he felt something he had never felt in the shelter or the workshop or the alley. He felt safe. Over the years, he had expanded it. He had shored up the walls with driftwood timbers and packed the gaps with a mixture of clay, crushed oyster shell, and dried seagrass, the same technique the Karankawa people had used for centuries along this coast. He had learned about this from an old shrimper named Tomas, who lived on the bayside and who was the only person in Galveston who ever treated Elijah like a human being. Tomas taught him that the native people understood something the European settlers refused to accept. You do not build on top of this island. You build into it. The wind will take anything that stands up, but it cannot take what is already part of the ground. Elijah listened. He always listened. He packed the walls 3 feet thick with his mixture and let it cure in the sun before covering it back over. He built a ventilation shaft from old ship pipe that drew fresh air down into the chamber and expelled stale air through a second shaft on the opposite side. He lined the floor with layers of crushed shell and sand for drainage, then laid salvaged ship planking over that for a dry, solid surface. He hung sailcloth from the ceiling to catch condensation and channel it into a clay pot for drinking water. He built a small firebox from salvaged brick with a flue that ran horizontally through the earth wall before venting outside, a technique that heated the surrounding clay and radiated warmth for hours after the fire had gone out. The smoke dispersed through the soil and grass above, invisible for more than 20 feet away. He stored food in the cool lower sections, salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth, hardtack dried fish, jars of pickled vegetables he had traded labor for at the market. He preserved fruit in a syrup of sugar and seawater, a method Domas had taught him, the salt preventing spoilage while the sugar kept the flavor. But Elijah was building something else too. Something that consumed every spare hour he had. He was building a boat, not a large boat, not a schooner or a sloop or anything that would make the shipwrights at the Galveston dry dock take notice. It was a small sailing skiff, 14 feet long, with a shallow draft designed for the coastal waters of the Gulf, and he was building it entirely from scraps. The keel was a piece of longleaf pine he had pulled from the surf after a tropical storm, still sound and straight despite its time in the water. The ribs were barrel staves, steam bent over his firebox and shaped with a draw knife Horace had given him years ago. The planking was a patchwork of salvaged wood, cypress, cedar, pine, even a piece of mahogany from a wrecked Cuban fishing boat. Each piece fitted and caulked with oakum and pine tar. The sail was his masterwork. He stitched it from over 40 pieces of scrap canvas, each one carefully selected for weight and weave, joined with the double flat seam Horace had taught him so that every junction was waterproof and strong enough to hold against a 30-knot wind. He reinforced the stress points with patches cut from that original scrap of sailcloth his mother had given him, not the whole piece, just small squares from the edges, so that his mother's gift was literally woven into the fabric of the boat. He worked on it for 3 years. Every morning before dawn he would climb down into his underground home and work by the light of a whale oil lamp until the sun came up. Then he would cover the entrance and walk to the docks to hire himself out as a day laborer, mending nets, caulking hulls, stitching sails for anyone who would pay. In the evenings he would return to his chamber and work until his eyes burned. The people of Galveston who knew he existed at all thought he was mad. A woman named Clara, who ran a laundry on Mechanic Street, once said to her customers, "That shelter boy is out there sewing rags together like he thinks he can fly." He will drown himself and save us all the trouble of looking at him." They laughed. They always laughed. Only one person did not laugh. Her name was Ada Cobb, and she was 3,000 miles away, and she had been searching for her son for 20 years. Ada had not abandoned Elijah. She had been taken. On that October morning in 1880, she had left her son at the county home, intending to be gone only 3 days. She had received a letter, she believed, from her late husband's family in Cornwall, England, saying they had an inheritance for the boy, enough to give him a life. She had booked passage on a mail packet to New Orleans, where she planned to meet an agent who would arrange her crossing. But there was no inheritance. The letter was a forgery. The agent was a man who trafficked in vulnerable women, and Ada was taken aboard a ship bound for Liverpool and forced into domestic servitude in a cotton mill owner's household in Lancashire. It took her 8 years to escape. 8 years of scrubbing floors and washing linens and sleeping in an attic room with a locked door. She escaped in 1888 by climbing out a window during a rainstorm, dropping 15 feet into a garden, and walking 26 miles to the port of Liverpool with no shoes and a broken wrist. She worked her way back across the Atlantic on a cargo vessel, gutting fish in the hold for 14 weeks, sleeping between crates of Manchester cotton bound for the very same Galveston wharves where she had last held her son's hand. When she arrived in Galveston in the spring of 1889, Elijah was already gone from the county home. Mrs. Flagg had died. The records were incomplete. Ada was told the boy had been apprenticed somewhere, maybe to a sailmaker, maybe to a fisherman. Nobody could remember. She searched for 2 years, walking the streets of Galveston, asking at every workshop and dock. But Elijah had grown into a man she did not recognize, and he did not know she was looking. In 1891, Ada took work as a seamstress in Houston, 50 miles inland, saving every penny to fund her search. She placed advertisements in the Galveston Daily News. She wrote to every orphanage and work home in Texas. She carried the matching piece of sailcloth in her apron pocket every day, rubbing it between her fingers until the weave was as familiar as her own skin. By 1900, Ada was 51 years old. She had been searching for 20 years. She had moved back to Galveston that spring, taking a room above a dry goods store on the Strand because she had received a tip from a dock worker who said there was a man on the west end of the island who sewed sails and lived like a hermit and had no people. Ada did not know if this was her son. She only knew she had to look. And then the hurricane came. The Great Galveston Hurricane of September 8, 1900, remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. The storm surge reached over 15 feet, submerging the entire island. Winds exceeded 140 miles per hour. Every structure along the beachfront was obliterated. The grand mansions on Broadway Avenue, the ones whose owners had crossed the street to avoid Elijah Cobb, were torn apart like paper. The banker Hartwell's 3-story house collapsed at 9 in the evening and killed everyone inside. The storm arrived with a sound that survivors described as a locomotive made of water. The barometric pressure dropped so fast that people's ears bled. The sky turned the color of a bruise, green and yellow and black, and the Gulf rose up and swallowed the island in a single, slow, monstrous breath. Elijah felt it coming 2 days before it hit. He smelled the copper on the wind, just as Horace had taught him. He watched the swells in the Gulf grow longer and deeper, rolling in from the southeast with a rhythm that spoke of something massive turning out there in the open water. He saw the brick-red sunset on the evening of September 6th and knew. He went to the dock where he had been working and told the foreman, "There is a storm coming. A bad one. You should move inland." The foreman laughed and said, "The Weather Bureau says it will pass to the east. Go home, shelter boy." Elijah did go home. He climbed down into his underground chamber and began to prepare. He sealed the ventilation shafts with cork plugs he had carved for this purpose and covered them with layers of tarred canvas and packed earth. He reinforced the entrance with the hatch made from 3 layers of ship planking bolted together and sealed with oakum. He stocked water, food, lamp oil. He checked the drainage channels. He moved his boat, his precious patchwork boat, to the deepest part of the chamber and covered it with sailcloth. Then he sat in the warm, dry darkness of his underground home and listened to the world above him try to tear itself apart. The sound was beyond description. It was not wind. It was not rain. It was the voice of something older than language, a roaring, grinding, shrieking fury that went on for hour after hour without pause. The earth around him trembled. Water seeped through the walls in thin rivulets, but the clay and oyster shell mixture held. The drainage channels carried the water away. The temperature inside stayed steady. The geothermal insulation of the earth keeping the chamber at a constant 68 degrees, while the air above was a chaos of wind-driven rain and salt spray that stripped paint from wood and skin from bone. Elijah sat with his hands on the hull of his boat and felt the vibration of the storm through the earth and through the wood and through his own bones, and he thought of his mother. He thought of her kneeling on the dock. He thought of her eyes, which were the same color as the Gulf on a calm day, gray-green with flecks of gold. He thought of the sailcloth, and he pressed his hand against the patches sewn into the sail of his boat, and he said out loud in the roaring darkness, "I am still here." Above him, Galveston died. The storm surge swept over the island in a wall of water that carried houses, telegraph poles, railroad cars, horses, and human beings, in a grinding mass of debris that crushed everything in its path. The saltgrass flats, where Elijah's entrance was hidden, were submerged under 8 feet of water, but the entrance held. The hatch flexed and groaned, but did not break. The water pressed against it and found no way in, because Elijah had built it the way the Karankawa had taught through Tomas, not to fight the water but to let the earth absorb it, the thick clay walls drinking the moisture and holding it like a sponge while the interior remained dry. He stayed underground for 36 hours. When he finally unsealed the hatch and climbed out into the light on the morning of September 10th, the world he had known was gone. The island was a flat, featureless plain of mud and debris. There were no houses, there were no trees, there were no streets. There were bodies, thousands of bodies, tangled in wreckage that stretched from the beach to the bay in an unbroken field of destruction. The smell hit him first, salt and mud, and something sweet and terrible underneath. The silence hit him second. No birds, no waves, no voices. Just the slow drip of water from things that should not have been where they were. A piano in a salt cedar, a bathtub on a pile of bricks, a child's shoe hanging from a piece of telegraph wire. Elijah stood in the mud and wept. Then he began to work. He pulled his boat from the underground chamber, dragged it across the mud flats, and launched it into the still flooded streets of what had been Galveston. He sailed through water that was chest-deep in places, navigating by landmarks that no longer existed, steering around the dead with a boat hook made from a curtain rod and a bent nail. He found survivors clinging to rooftops and floating on doors and calling from inside collapsed buildings where air pockets had kept them alive. He loaded them into his little patchwork skiff, 3 and 4 at a time, and ferried them to the highest ground he could find, which was the foundation of the old Ursuline convent, one of the few structures still partially standing. He made 17 trips that first day. Among the people he pulled from the water was Clara, the laundrywoman who had said he would drown himself. She was clinging to a wooden washtub with a broken arm and a gash across her forehead that had bled until her face was a mask of red. When she saw the patchwork sail and the shelter boy standing at the tiller, she began to cry. She said, "I am sorry. Oh God, I am sorry." Elijah said nothing. He reached down and pulled her into the boat. He also found Partridge, the creditor who had taken Horace's workshop. Partridge was sitting on the roof of his grain store, which was the only part of the building still above water, and he was holding a strong box that turned out to contain nothing but wet paper. When Elijah pulled alongside, Partridge stared at the boat with his mouth open and said, "How? How is this still floating?" Elijah said, "Because I built it from scraps, and scraps do not break the same way as something that thinks it is whole." On the second day, Elijah began bringing survivors to his underground chamber. It could hold 15 people if they sat close together, and the temperature was steady, and the water was clean from the condensation system, and there was food enough for 3 days if rationed carefully. He brought the injured first, the ones with broken bones and gashes, and the glassy-eyed shock that made them sit where you put them and stare at nothing. He treated wounds with strips of sailcloth soaked in seawater, the salt acting as a crude antiseptic, another thing Thomas had taught him. Over the following week, more than 60 people passed through Elijah's underground shelter. He fed them salt pork and hardtack and pickled vegetables. He kept the firebox burning to dry their clothes and warm their bones. He stitched torn flesh with the same needle and thread he used on his sails, and more than one person who should have died from infection survived because of the clean, stable environment of that underground chamber. The city that had called him Shelter Rat owed its surviving fragments to the shelter he had built in the earth. But there is one more thing to tell, and it is the part that matters most. On the third day after the hurricane, Elijah was sailing his skiff through the debris field near the strand when he saw something caught in a tangle of wreckage. It was a woman, unconscious, draped over a beam with her arm trailing in the water. Her hair was gray, her face was thin and weathered. She was breathing, but barely. He pulled her into the boat and laid her on the floorboards and covered her with a piece of sailcloth. And as he tucked it around her shoulders, he saw something that made his hands go still. In her right hand, clenched so tightly that the knuckles were white even in unconsciousness, was a scrap of cloth. Sailcloth. Old, worn, soft. The same faded ochre color as the piece his mother had given him 20 years ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own scrap, the one he had carried every day of his life, and he held the two pieces together, and the weave matched. The thread count matched, the faded dye matched. Even the frayed edges fit together like puzzle pieces, because they had been cut from the same sail, the sail his father had built with his own hands before Elijah was born. He looked at the woman's face. He looked at her eyes, which were closed, but which he knew with a certainty that went deeper than memory, were gray-green with flecks of gold. He said very quietly, "Mama." Ada Cobb opened her eyes. She looked at the patchwork sail above her, and she saw the small squares of familiar cloth stitched into its fabric, and she understood. She reached up and touched his face with fingers that were cold and wrinkled and shaking, and she said, "Elijah, my boy." I never stopped looking. He held her hand against his cheek and felt the calluses on her fingers, the same calluses a seamstress gets from years of pushing a needle through cloth, the same calluses he had on his own hands. And he said, "I know, I was not lost. I was just building something strong enough for you to find me." The city of Galveston rebuilt itself in the years that followed. They raised the grade of the entire island by 17 feet, pumping sand from the Gulf floor and lifting every surviving building on jacks and filling beneath them. They built a seawall 17 feet high and 3 miles long. They learned, as the Karankawa had known all along, that you cannot fight the water. You can only build in a way that respects it. Elijah Cobb became the foreman of the seawall construction project. Not because anyone appointed him, but because he was the only man on the island who understood how to build something that the Gulf could not destroy. He taught the workers the clay and shell mixture. He taught them the drainage channels and the geothermal insulation and the way to lay brick so that water flowed around it instead of through it. He taught them everything Horace and Thomas had taught him, and everything the earth itself had taught him in those years underground. Ada lived with him in a new house he built on the west end, above ground this time, but with a foundation that went 6 feet deep into the clay, anchored with the same techniques he had used in his chamber. She kept a garden of salt-tolerant vegetables, rosemary and sea purslane and beach morning glory, and she hung the 2 matching pieces of sailcloth in the window where the Gulf breeze could move them. The people of Galveston never called him Shelter Boy again. They called him the Stitcher, and they meant it with respect. Clara, the laundry woman, brought him clean shirts every week until the day she died. Partridge donated the deed to Horace's old workshop back to Elijah, along with an apology that he delivered with his hat in his hands and tears on his face. But Elijah did not keep the workshop for himself. He turned it into a school for orphan children, a place where they could learn sailmaking and carpentry and the old survival techniques that had kept him alive. He hung a sign above the door that read, in letters he carved himself, "Nothing is a scrap. Everything is a sail waiting to be stitched." Years later, when a reporter from the Houston Chronicle asked him how a boy left at his shelter with nothing but a piece of cloth had survived the deadliest hurricane in American history, Elijah looked out at the Gulf, calm and blue and glittering in the afternoon light, and he said something that Ada always claimed was the wisest thing she had ever heard anyone say. He said, "The storm does not care who you are. It does not care if you are rich or poor, loved or forgotten. It only cares what you have built, and the things you build from scraps, the things you stitch together from what other people throw away, those are the things that hold, because they were never pretending to be something they were not. They were honest from the first stitch, and honest things do not break." Ada squeezed his hand. The sailcloth in the window moved in the breeze, and somewhere out in the Gulf the water was calm, the way it always is after it has finished teaching its lesson.